Marcus, I need to talk to you about the restaurant expenses, I said, holding the stack of credit card statements that had arrived that morning. My son looked up from his laptop with that familiar expression of mild annoyance he'd perfected over the past 2 years. Mom, you're worrying about nothing again. The business is doing great. Sometimes you have to spend money to make money. But as I stared at the numbers in front of me, something cold settled in my stomach. $28,000 charged to my personal credit card in the last month alone. For a restaurant I'll never even seen the inside of? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Patricia Caldwell, and for 35 years, I built something I thought would last forever. Starting with a single food truck parked outside construction sites in Phoenix, Arizona, I worked 16-hour days serving breakfast burritos and hot coffee to workers who became like family to me. By the time I was 58, that single truck had grown into Caldwell Catering, the most successful event catering company in the Southwest. We handled everything from intimate wedding receptions to corporate events for thousands of people. My kitchen facility employed 47 people, and my reputation for reliability and quality had taken decades to earn. When my husband Robert died unexpectedly from a heart attack 3 years ago, I thought my world had ended. We'd built the business together, with him handling the administrative side while I focused on the food and customer relationships. Suddenly, at 61, I was trying to manage contracts, payroll, insurance, and expansion plans while still maintaining the quality that made Caldwell Catering special. The grief was overwhelming, but the business kept me going. It gave me purpose when everything else felt meaningless. Marcus had always been my pride and joy. At 34, he was charming, ambitious, and had inherited his father's gift for numbers and his mother's determination. He'd spent his 20s traveling, trying different careers, and what he called finding himself. When he married Jessica 2 years ago, I was thrilled. She seemed perfect for him, organized and supportive, with a business degree and big dreams. More importantly, Marcus finally seemed ready to settle down and maybe even join the family business that Robert and I had always hoped he'd take over someday. The conversation about Marcus joining Caldwell Catering started innocently enough. He and Jessica had been married for 6 months, and they were renting a small apartment while saving money for a house. During one of our weekly Sunday dinners, Marcus mentioned feeling frustrated with his job at a marketing firm downtown. "The pay is decent, but I'm not building anything meaningful," he said. "I'm just making other people rich while I stay stuck in the same position." Jessica nodded supportively. "We've been talking about how Marcus has all these great ideas for business ventures, but he needs startup capital to make them happen." She reached across my dining room table to squeeze my hand. "You've built something incredible with the catering company, Patricia. Marcus grew up watching you and Robert create success from nothing. Maybe it's time for the next generation to carry on that legacy." The idea made perfect sense. Marcus was intelligent and motivated, and I was getting tired of handling every aspect of the business alone. "What kind of venture are you thinking about?" I asked. Marcus's eyes lit up with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen since he was a child. "A restaurant, Mom. Not just any restaurant, but a high-end place that showcases the kind of quality food Caldwell Catering is known for. Think about it. We already have the supplier relationships, the kitchen expertise, and the reputation. A restaurant would be the perfect next step." Jessica pulled out her phone and showed me photos she'd saved of elegant restaurant interiors. "We've been researching locations and concepts for months. There's this perfect space downtown that just became available. It used to be Romano's, remember? The Italian place that closed last year?" I did remember Romano's. It had been a Phoenix institution for 20 years before the owners retired. The space was beautiful, with exposed brick walls, hardwood floors, and a commercial kitchen that had been recently updated. "The rent would be expensive, though," I said. "That's where we'd need your help initially," Marcus said. "Not a loan, but more like an investment. You become a silent partner in the restaurant, and once we're profitable, you get your investment back, plus a percentage of the profits going forward." The proposal sounded reasonable, especially when they showed me the business plan Jessica had prepared. She'd researched everything from startup costs to projected revenue, and the numbers looked promising. Against my better judgment, or maybe because I wanted so desperately to believe in my son's dreams, I agreed to provide the initial investment, $50,000 to cover the security deposit, first year's rent, and initial renovation costs. "This is just the beginning, Mom," Marcus said, hugging me tightly after I wrote the check. "You're going to be so proud of what we build together." The restaurant renovation took 4 months, and I watched with growing concern as the costs multiplied beyond anything we'd discussed. The original $50,000 became $75,000 when they discovered the kitchen ventilation system needed complete replacement. That became $90,000 when Jessica decided the dining room needed custom millwork and designer lighting fixtures. Each request came with detailed explanations about why these upgrades were essential for the restaurant's success. "Mom, you have to understand that customers expect a certain level of sophistication when they're paying premium prices for dinner," Marcus explained when I questioned the mounting expenses. "We can't compete with chain restaurants by offering the same basic environment. The ambiance is just as important as the food." Jessica nodded in agreement, showing me photos of successful restaurants in Scottsdale and Tempe that had similar design elements. "Patricia, we're not just opening a restaurant. We're creating an experience. That's what will set us apart and ensure long-term profitability." By the time Romano's reopened as Elevate, my total investment had reached $130,000. The restaurant looked stunning, I had to admit. The combination of industrial and elegant design elements created an atmosphere that felt both sophisticated and welcoming. The menu featured elevated versions of comfort food classics, with prices that reflected the upscale environment. Opening night was a huge success, with a packed dining room full of friends, family, and local food critics who seemed genuinely impressed. For the first 3 months, everything seemed to be going according to plan. Marcus would call me every few days to update me on customer feedback, reservations, and revenue numbers. "We're booked solid most weekends," he'd tell me proudly, "and the reviews have been incredible. People love what we're doing." Jessica would send me photos of beautiful dishes and happy customers, along with thank you messages about how grateful they were for my support in making their dreams possible. But then the additional funding requests started arriving. "Mom, we need to expand our marketing budget," Marcus explained during a family dinner at the restaurant. "Word of mouth is great, but we need consistent advertising to build our weekday business." That request was for $15,000 to cover digital marketing, social media management, and food photography. A month later, Jessica called to explain that they needed new point-of-sale equipment and updated kitchen appliances to handle their growing business volume. Another $22,000. Each request came with convincing explanations and detailed justifications. The marketing investment would increase revenue by attracting new customers. The equipment upgrades would improve efficiency and food quality. The additional staff they wanted to hire would enhance customer service and allow them to handle larger parties. Every expense seemed reasonable when they explained it, and I wanted the restaurant to succeed as much as they did. What I didn't realize at the time was that I never actually saw any of the restaurant's financial records. Marcus and Jessica would tell me about their success, but I never saw profit and loss statements, tax returns, or bank account balances. When I asked about reviewing the books, Jessica would explain that their accountant was still organizing everything, or that they were waiting for certain expenses to be finalized before they could provide accurate numbers. "As soon as we have our first quarterly report finished, we'll sit down and go through everything together," she promised.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
6 months after opening, my total investment in Elevate had grown to over $200,000. That's when I made the decision that changed everything. Instead of continuing to write checks based on their verbal reports, I decided to surprise them with an unannounced visit to the restaurant during lunch on a Tuesday afternoon. I wanted to see firsthand how busy they were during their slower weekday period and maybe grab a meal while watching my son in his element. The restaurant was nearly empty when I arrived at 12:30. Only 3 tables were occupied in a dining room designed to seat 80 people. The hostess, a young woman I didn't recognize, seemed surprised to see me. "Are you here for lunch?" she asked politely. "Actually, I'm Patricia Caldwell. I'm Marcus's mother and one of the restaurant's investors." Her expression changed immediately, and she looked uncomfortable. "Oh, Marcus isn't here right now. Neither is Jessica. They usually don't come in until later in the evening." I decided to stay for lunch anyway, curious to experience the restaurant from a customer's perspective. The food was excellent, I had to admit. The roasted chicken dish I ordered was perfectly prepared and beautifully presented. But the service was slow, despite the nearly empty dining room, and I noticed several issues that concerned me as someone with decades of restaurant industry experience. The server seemed unfamiliar with the menu, unable to answer basic questions about ingredients and preparation methods. The restaurant was cold, as if they were trying to save money on heating costs. Most troubling was the overall atmosphere of a business that was struggling rather than thriving. After finishing my meal, I asked to speak with whoever was managing the restaurant that day. A young man named Tyler emerged from the kitchen, introducing himself as the assistant manager. "I've been wondering when we'd finally meet you," he said with a smile. "Marcus and Jessica talk about you all the time. Thank you for everything you've done to help get this place started." His gratitude seemed genuine, but when I started asking questions about the restaurant's performance, his answers didn't match what Marcus and Jessica had been telling me. "How has business been lately?" I asked. Tyler glanced around the empty dining room and shrugged. "It's been pretty slow, to be honest. We do okay on Friday and Saturday nights, but the rest of the week has been challenging. We're hoping things pick up as more people discover us." When I mentioned that Marcus had told me they were booked solid most weekends, Tyler looked confused. "We do get busy on weekends, but I wouldn't say we're ever completely booked. Maybe during our first month when all the opening buzz was happening." The conversation with Tyler planted seeds of doubt that grew stronger over the following weeks. I started paying closer attention to Marcus and Jessica's reports about the restaurant's success, looking for inconsistencies in their stories. When Marcus claimed they'd had their best month ever in terms of revenue, I drove by the restaurant several times during peak dinner hours and noticed the parking lot was only half full. When Jessica posted photos on social media showing crowded dining rooms, I realized the images were from opening night and other special events, not regular business nights. But the real shock came when I received my monthly credit card statement and discovered charges I'd never authorized. $28,000 in expenses for the restaurant, charged directly to my personal credit card without my knowledge or permission. The charges included everything from liquor distributor payments to equipment rentals to advertising expenses. When I called the credit card company to dispute the charges, they informed me that the card was linked to the restaurant's account as an authorized payment method, and that Marcus was listed as an authorized user on my account. That's when I realized how completely I'd been manipulated. Marcus and Jessica hadn't just been asking for investments in their restaurant, they'd been systematically draining my resources while painting a picture of success that didn't exist. The business plan, the profit projections, the stories about packed dining rooms and growing revenue, all of it had been carefully constructed lies designed to keep me writing checks while they lived off my money. The confrontation happened on a Thursday evening when I showed up at their apartment unannounced, carrying copies of my credit card statements and a folder full of questions I needed answered. Marcus opened the door wearing expensive clothes I'd never seen before, and I could see Jessica in the background organizing what looked like designer shopping bags. "Mom, what a nice surprise," Marcus said, but his smile faltered when he saw the expression on my face. "We need to talk," I said, walking past him into their living room. The apartment had been transformed since my last visit. New furniture, a large flat-screen television, and artwork that probably cost more than most people made in a month. "I just received my credit card statement, and I have some questions about charges I didn't authorize." Jessica appeared from the bedroom, her face flushing red when she saw the papers in my hands. Patricia, let us explain, she started, but I held up my hand to stop her. I visited the restaurant on Tuesday, I said. It was nearly empty, and the staff told me business has been slow for months. That's very different from what you've been telling me. Marcus sat down heavily on their expensive new couch, running his hands through his hair. Mom, the restaurant business is complicated. We've been trying to protect you from worrying about the day-to-day challenges while we work through some temporary issues. The word temporary felt like a slap in the face. I'd been hearing about temporary issues for months while my savings account grew smaller and my credit card balance grew larger. How much of my money have you actually spent on the restaurant, and how much have you spent on yourselves? I asked, gesturing around their upgraded apartment. The question hung in the air for a long moment before Jessica finally spoke. We've been working so hard to make the restaurant successful. Sometimes we need to present a certain image to attract investors and customers. The clothes, the apartment, the car payments, they're all part of building credibility in the business community. That's when Marcus said the words that shattered whatever remained of our relationship. Mom, I think you're just jealous of our success. You've been running the same catering business for decades, and now you're watching us build something bigger and more ambitious. Maybe that's hard for you to accept. The accusation was so absurd, so cruel, and so completely opposite of the truth that I actually laughed out loud. Success? I repeated. You call lying to me about your restaurant's performance while secretly charging expenses to my credit card success? You call manipulating your mother out of over $200,000 success? Jessica tried to interrupt, but I was just getting started. I've been supporting both of you for months while you've been living off my money and pretending to be successful entrepreneurs. That's not success, Marcus. That's fraud. The argument that followed revealed the full extent of their deception. The restaurant was losing money every month and had been since the third week after opening. Marcus and Jessica had been using my credit cards to cover not just business expenses, but their personal living costs, car payments, shopping trips, and even a vacation to Hawaii they'd claimed was a business conference. They'd been lying to me about everything while using my financial support to maintain a lifestyle they couldn't afford. But the most painful part wasn't the money they'd stolen or even the lies they'd told. It was the realization that my own son had looked me in the eye for months, accepted my help and support, and then accused me of being jealous when I finally discovered the truth. Everything I thought I knew about Marcus, about our relationship, about the values I'd tried to teach him, all of it felt like an illusion that had finally been stripped away. That night, I went home to my empty house and sat at the kitchen table where Robert and I had planned our business expansion, where we'd celebrated our successes and worked through our challenges together. I thought about the food truck we'd started with nothing but determination and a dream to build something meaningful. I thought about the employees who depended on Caldwell Catering for their livelihoods, and the customers who trusted us with their most important celebrations. Then I thought about my son, who had taken the foundation his father and I had built and used it to fund a fantasy lifestyle while calling me jealous when I asked for honesty. The betrayal cut deeper than any business loss I'd ever experienced, because this wasn't just about money. This was about trust, family, and the values that were supposed to matter more than financial gain. But as I sat there in the quiet of my kitchen, surrounded by 3 decades of memories and accomplishments, I realized something important.
Marcus might have taken advantage of my love and trust, but he hadn't taken my strength or my ability to fight back. I'd built a successful business from nothing once before, and I could certainly figure out how to protect what remained of it from my own son's greed. The next morning, I made 3 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to my attorney to discuss my legal options for recovering the money that had been stolen from me. The second was to my accountant to review my financial situation and protect my assets from any future unauthorized access. The third call was to a private investigator, because I suspected that what I'd discovered so far was only the beginning of Marcus and Jessica's deception. What we uncovered over the following weeks was worse than I'd imagined, but it also gave me the evidence I needed to fight back and reclaim not just my money, but my dignity and peace of mind. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones we love most, but that doesn't mean we have to let them destroy everything we've worked to build. The private investigator I hired was a woman named Carmen Rodriguez, recommended by my attorney as someone who specialized in financial fraud cases. Carmen had worked as a forensic accountant before becoming a private investigator, which made her perfect for untangling the web of deception that Marcus and Jessica had created. When we met at her office the following Tuesday, I brought every document I could find related to the restaurant investment and my credit card statements from the past year. Carmen reviewed everything methodically, taking notes and asking detailed questions about my interactions with Marcus and Jessica. "The unauthorized credit card usage is definitely criminal," she said, spreading the statements across her desk. "But I suspect there's more going on here than just charging expenses to your cards. The amounts are too large and too systematic for this to be impulsive spending." She was right to be suspicious. Over the next 2 weeks, Carmen's investigation revealed a pattern of financial manipulation that went far beyond what I'd discovered on my own. Marcus and Jessica hadn't just been using my money to fund their lifestyle and cover the restaurant's losses. They'd been systematically positioning themselves to take over my entire business empire. The first major revelation came when Carmen obtained copies of documents that had been filed with the state business registration office. Without my knowledge, Marcus had created a new corporation called Caldwell Hospitality Group and listed himself as the primary owner and operator. According to the paperwork, this new company was supposed to be the parent organization for both my catering business and the restaurant. But the legal structure gave Marcus controlling interest in all operations under the Caldwell name. "How is this possible?" I asked Carmen when she showed me the incorporation documents. "I never signed anything giving him control of my business." Carmen pointed to a signature at the bottom of the page that looked remarkably similar to mine. "This appears to be a forged signature, but it would take a handwriting expert to prove that in court. More importantly, look at the date this was filed. The documents had been submitted to the state 3 months before Marcus and Jessica ever approached me about investing in the restaurant. They'd been planning to take over my business long before they asked for my help with their supposed entrepreneurial dreams. The restaurant wasn't a business venture they wanted me to invest in. It was a front designed to give them legal claim to the Caldwell name and reputation while draining my resources." Carmen's investigation also uncovered bank records showing that Marcus and Jessica had opened multiple business accounts using variations of the Caldwell name. Money from my credit cards had been flowing into these accounts, then transferred to personal accounts they controlled. They'd created an entire financial infrastructure designed to funnel my money into their control while making it look like legitimate business expenses. But the most shocking discovery came when Carmen traced the ownership of the building where Elevate was located. The property wasn't owned by an independent landlord, as Marcus and Jessica had claimed. It was owned by a real estate investment company that Jessica's father had created specifically to purchase the building. Instead of paying rent to an outside party, Marcus and Jessica had been funneling my investment money directly to Jessica's family through inflated lease payments. The entire restaurant operation was designed to transfer your wealth to their extended family network, Carmen explained during our third meeting. The renovation costs, the equipment purchases, the ongoing expenses, most of it ended up in accounts controlled by Jessica's relatives. They created a business structure that made you the sole source of funding while giving them and their family members control over how that money was spent. Armed with this evidence, my attorney filed criminal charges for fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement. We also initiated civil proceedings to recover the stolen funds and dissolve the fraudulent corporations Marcus had created. But even with overwhelming evidence of their crimes, Marcus and Jessica weren't prepared to admit defeat. Instead, they launched a counterattack that revealed just how calculating and ruthless they had become. The first sign of their retaliation came when I arrived at my catering facility on a Thursday morning to find a notice from the health department posted on the front door. According to the document, an anonymous complaint had been filed claiming that Caldwell Catering was operating with expired licenses and unsafe food handling practices. The inspection that followed was the most thorough I'd experienced in 35 years of business. And while we passed with flying colors, the disruption cost me 3 days of production and forced to cancel 2 major events. That same week, several of my long-term clients received anonymous letters claiming that I was under investigation for tax evasion and that my business was in financial trouble.
The letters suggested that customers should consider finding alternative catering services to avoid potential problems with their events. I lost 4 contracts worth over $60,000 before I could identify the source of the letters and convince my clients that the allegations were false. The harassment escalated when Marcus and Jessica hired their own attorney and filed a lawsuit claiming that I had verbally agreed to transfer ownership of my catering business to them as part of the restaurant investment deal. According to their lawsuit, the money I'd provided wasn't a loan or investment, but payment for my existing business assets. They claimed I'd promised to retire and turn operations over to them, and that I was now trying to back out of our agreement. The legal battle consumed months of my life and tens of thousands of dollars in attorney fees. Marcus and Jessica had clearly hoped that the cost and stress of defending myself would force me to settle their claims and let them keep at least some of what they'd stolen. But they'd underestimated my determination to protect the business Robert and I had built together, and they'd seriously misjudged my willingness to fight for what was right. During the discovery phase of the lawsuit, my attorney was able to subpoena records that revealed even more of their deception. Text messages between Marcus and Jessica showed they'd been planning their scheme for over a year before approaching me about the restaurant investment. The messages revealed conversations about bleeding Mom dry, taking over the catering empire, and making sure she can't fight back once we control everything. One particularly damaging text from Jessica to Marcus read, "Your mom is so predictable. Show her a business plan and mention your dad's legacy, and she'll write a check for anything. We just need to keep her distracted long enough to get legal control of her assets." Marcus's response was equally cold. "She's getting suspicious about the credit card charges. We might need to accelerate the timeline and force her out of the catering business before she figures out what we're really doing." The text messages also revealed that they'd been laughing about my visits to the restaurant and mocking my questions about the business performance. "She actually believes we're booked solid," Jessica had written after one of our dinner conversations. "I love how she tries to give us business advice when she doesn't even know we're stealing from her every day." But perhaps the most heartbreaking discovery was a series of messages where Marcus and Jessica discussed what they called the final phase of their plan. Once they'd gained legal control of my assets, they intended to force me into a retirement home and claim I was mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs. "Once we have her declared unfit, we can liquidate everything and start over with a clean slate," one message read. Reading those messages felt like being punched in the stomach. This wasn't just about money or business assets. My own son had been planning to destroy my independence and dignity while convincing himself that he was entitled to everything I'd worked to build. The person I'd raised, supported, and loved unconditionally had been systematically plotting to eliminate me from my own life. The turning point in our legal battle came when Carmen discovered that Marcus and Jessica had made a critical mistake in their financial manipulation. In their eagerness to drain my accounts as quickly as possible, they'd charged several personal expenses to business credit cards, creating a clear paper trail of fraud that couldn't be explained away as legitimate investment costs. Luxury vacation expenses, designer clothing purchases, and high-end electronics had all been charged as restaurant business expenses. More damaging was the discovery that they'd been double billing for many restaurant expenses. They would charge my credit card for equipment or supplies, then submit the same invoices to business accounts for reimbursement, effectively getting paid twice for the same expenses. The pattern of double billing created a clear record of intentional fraud that destroyed their claims about accidentally mishandling business finances. When confronted with this evidence during depositions, both Marcus and Jessica's stories began falling apart. Under oath, they contradicted each other repeatedly and couldn't explain discrepancies in their financial records. Marcus claimed that Jessica handled all the bookkeeping, while Jessica insisted that Marcus made all the financial decisions. Neither could provide coherent explanations for why personal expenses had been charged as business costs or how they'd managed to lose over $200,000 in less than a year. The restaurant itself had become another piece of evidence against them. When the court ordered an independent assessment of Elevate's financial condition, the results were devastating to their credibility. The business had never turned a profit in any month of operation. Revenue records showed that on their best nights, they barely covered their daily operating costs. Most weeks, the restaurant generated less income than they spent on utilities and basic supplies. The independent assessment also revealed that much of the expensive equipment and renovations I'd paid for had never actually been purchased or completed. Invoices for $30,000 worth of kitchen equipment led to a storage unit filled with used appliances that Marcus and Jessica had bought from restaurant liquidation sales for less than $5,000. The custom millwork and designer fixtures that had supposedly cost $40,000 were actually standard items purchased from commercial suppliers for a fraction of the claimed cost. As the evidence mounted against them, Marcus and Jessica's legal strategy shifted from claiming legitimacy to blaming each other. Marcus's attorney argued that Jessica had manipulated him into participating in fraud, portraying him as another victim of her schemes. Jessica's attorney countered by claiming that Marcus had used his family relationship to gain access to my finances, then coerced her into helping him steal money from his own mother. But the most revealing moment came during Marcus's deposition when my attorney asked him directly about his motivations for targeting my business assets. You spent 34 years watching your mother build a successful company. Why did you think you were entitled to take control of her life's work without her knowledge or consent?
Marcus's answer shocked everyone in the room. "She's getting old," he said with casual indifference. "She can't run that business forever, and she doesn't have anyone else to leave it to. We were just accelerating the inevitable transition and making sure the Caldwell name would continue with someone who could actually grow the company instead of just maintaining it." The arrogance and entitlement in that statement perfectly captured everything that had gone wrong in our relationship. Marcus genuinely believed that his desires and ambitions mattered more than my rights or wishes. He'd convinced himself that stealing from me was justified because he thought he could manage my business better than I could. In his mind, I was just an obstacle preventing him from claiming what he already considered his inheritance. When Jessica was deposed, her testimony revealed the cold calculation behind their scheme. "We researched elder financial abuse cases and learned from other people's mistakes," she admitted under oath. "Most family fraud gets discovered because people get greedy too quickly. We planned everything to look legitimate and spread the financial transfers over time to avoid triggering suspicion." She described their manipulation strategy with clinical detachment, explaining how they'd identified my emotional vulnerabilities and exploited my desire to support Marcus's dreams. Patricia wanted to believe her son was finally becoming successful, Jessica said. "We gave her a story that matched her expectations and made her feel like she was contributing to something meaningful." The restaurant was never supposed to succeed. It was just a vehicle for transferring her assets to us. The civil case concluded with a judgment requiring Marcus and Jessica to repay everything they'd stolen, plus damages and attorney fees.
The criminal charges resulted in plea agreements that included prison time for both of them, though less than I'd hoped for given the magnitude of their fraud. Marcus received 3 years in state prison, while Jessica received 2.5 years. But recovering my money proved more complicated than winning the legal judgments. Marcus and Jessica had spent most of what they'd stolen on luxury expenses that couldn't be recovered. The luxury items they'd purchased had depreciated significantly, and many of their assets were jointly owned with family members who claimed to be innocent third parties. After 18 months of legal proceedings, I managed to recover about 60% of what they'd taken. But the emotional and financial costs of the fight had been enormous. The restaurant closed permanently during the legal proceedings, and the building was eventually sold to satisfy court judgments. The Caldwell Hospitality Group Corporation was dissolved, and all fraudulent business registrations were reversed. My catering company survived the ordeal, but the disruption had cost me several major contracts and damaged relationships with clients who'd been confused by the conflicting legal claims. More painful than the financial losses was the realization of how completely I'd been deceived by people I loved and trusted. Every conversation, every family dinner, every expression of gratitude had been part of an elaborate performance designed to keep me funding their scheme while they planned to eliminate me from my own life. The son I'd raised and supported had looked me in the eye for months while systematically stealing my security and independence. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire experience was discovering how many people had suspected something was wrong but hadn't said anything. Tyler, the restaurant manager, later admitted he'd known from the beginning that the business numbers didn't add up to the success Marcus and Jessica claimed. Several of my employees at the catering company had noticed changes in my behavior and stress levels but hadn't felt comfortable asking direct questions about my personal life. Even some of my friends had wondered about Marcus and Jessica's sudden lifestyle improvements and expensive purchases, but they'd assumed I was financially supporting them by choice, rather than being manipulated. The conspiracy of silence around family financial abuse had protected Marcus and Jessica's scheme and prolonged my victimization, even when warning signs were visible to multiple people. Recovery from betrayal this deep required more than just legal victories and financial restitution. I had to rebuild my ability to trust my own judgment, question my assumptions about family loyalty, and create new boundaries to protect myself from future manipulation. The woman who'd confidently built a business empire from a single food truck had been reduced to someone who doubted her own perceptions and questioned every relationship in her life. The months following Marcus and Jessica's sentencing were the hardest of my life, harder even than losing Robert. Grief over a spouse's death, as devastating as it is, comes with community support and understanding. People bring casseroles, send flowers, and acknowledge your loss with genuine compassion. But grief over a child's betrayal is isolating and complicated, filled with shame and self-doubt that makes it difficult to accept comfort from others. I found myself avoiding social situations where people might ask about Marcus or express sympathy for what they saw as family troubles rather than criminal victimization. Well-meaning friends would suggest that family disagreements could be resolved with time and forgiveness, not understanding that this wasn't a typical family conflict, but a calculated scheme to destroy my independence and steal my life's work. The son I'd raised and supported had looked me in the eye for months while systematically stealing my security and independence. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire experience was discovering how many people had suspected something was wrong but hadn't said anything. Tyler, the restaurant manager, later admitted he'd known from the beginning that the business numbers didn't add up to the success Marcus and Jessica claimed. Several of my employees at the catering company had noticed changes in my behavior and stress levels, but hadn't felt comfortable asking direct questions about my personal life. Even some of my friends had wondered about Marcus and Jessica's sudden lifestyle improvements and expensive purchases, but they'd assumed I was financially supporting them by choice, rather than being manipulated. The conspiracy of silence around family financial abuse had protected Marcus and Jessica's scheme and prolonged my victimization, even when warning signs were visible to multiple people. Recovery from betrayal this deep required more than just legal victories and financial restitution. I had to rebuild my ability to trust my own judgment, question my assumptions about family loyalty, and create new boundaries to protect myself from future manipulation. The woman who'd confidently built a business empire from a single food truck had been reduced to someone who doubted her own perceptions and questioned every relationship in her life. The months following Marcus and Jessica's sentencing were the hardest of my life, harder even than losing Robert. Grief over a spouse's death, as devastating as it is, comes with community support and understanding. People bring casseroles, send flowers, and acknowledge your loss with genuine compassion. But grief over a child's betrayal is isolating and complicated, filled with shame and self-doubt that makes it difficult to accept comfort from others. I found myself avoiding social situations where people might ask about Marcus or express sympathy for what they saw as family troubles rather than criminal victimization. Well-meaning friends would suggest that family disagreements can be resolved with time and forgiveness, not understanding that this wasn't a typical family conflict, but a calculated scheme to destroy my independence and steal my life's work.
The suggestion that I should eventually reconcile with my son felt like being asked to welcome back someone who had tried to erase me from my own existence. Sleep became elusive during those first months after the trials ended. I would lie awake replaying conversations with Marcus and Jessica, searching for signs I should have recognized earlier. The business plan they'd shown me had looked professional and convincing, but I wondered if I'd been too eager to believe in my son's dreams to evaluate it critically. Their explanations for cost overruns and poor restaurant performance had seemed reasonable at the time, but in hindsight, every excuse they'd offered contained inconsistencies I should have questioned. The financial recovery process continued long after the criminal cases concluded. Even with court judgments in my favor, actually collecting the money proved nearly impossible. Marcus and Jessica had spent most of what they'd stolen on experiences and purchases that couldn't be reversed. The Hawaiian vacation they'd claimed was a restaurant industry conference had cost $8,000 that was simply gone. Designer clothes, expensive dinners, and luxury car payments had consumed tens of thousands of dollars that couldn't be recovered through asset seizure. What made the financial losses even more painful was discovering how they justified their spending to each other and their friends. Text messages revealed during the legal proceedings showed they'd convinced themselves they deserved my money because they were working so hard to make the restaurant successful. We're basically employees of the restaurant, so taking a salary from Mom's investment makes sense, Jessica had written to a friend. She's getting equity in a valuable business, so everyone wins. The twisted logic they'd used to rationalize their theft demonstrated how completely they divorced themselves from any sense of moral responsibility. In their minds, my money had become their money the moment I'd agreed to invest in the restaurant, and anything they did with it was justified by their supposed efforts on behalf of the business. They'd created an entire alternative narrative where they were hardworking entrepreneurs and I was an overly controlling investor who didn't understand the demands of running a restaurant. Rebuilding my catering business required more than just recovering from the financial losses. The legal battles and negative publicity had damaged relationships with clients who'd been confused by conflicting stories about ownership and financial stability. Several major corporate clients had quietly moved their business to competitors during the months when my company's future seemed uncertain. Rebuilding those relationships required patience, consistency, and proof that Caldwell Catering was still the reliable partner they'd trusted for years.
I threw myself into the work of restoration with the same determination I'd brought to building the business originally. Every morning, I arrived at the kitchen facility before my employees and stayed late reviewing finances, updating systems, and personally overseeing every aspect of operations. The physical demands of the work were exhausting for a woman in her early 60s, but the structure and purpose helped channel my anger and disappointment into something productive. My employees had been incredibly loyal throughout the crisis. Even when there were weeks I wasn't certain I could make payroll on time. Maria Santos, my head chef, had worked for Caldwell Catering for 12 years and knew the business almost as well as I did. During the worst period of the legal battle, she'd quietly taken on additional responsibilities without being asked and had helped maintain quality standards even when everything else felt chaotic. Patricia, we all knew something wasn't right with that restaurant situation, Maria told me during one of our planning meetings. The numbers never made sense, and Marcus was asking questions about our suppliers and client list that seemed strange for someone supposedly focused on his own business. I wished she'd felt comfortable sharing those concerns earlier, but I understood why she hadn't. Questioning an owner's family relationships feels risky for employees, even when their observations might prevent disaster. The betrayal had also damaged my relationship with my extended family and social circle in ways I hadn't anticipated. Some relatives sided with Marcus, believing his version of events that portrayed me as an overbearing mother who'd refused to support his legitimate business aspirations. Family gatherings became minefields of awkward conversations and barely concealed judgment about my decision to pursue criminal charges against my own son. He made some mistakes, but sending him to prison seems excessive, my sister Linda said during a tense phone conversation 6 months after the sentencing. Families should find ways to work things out privately instead of involving the legal system. The suggestion that I'd overreacted to systematic fraud and theft felt like another betrayal, this time from people who should have understood the difference between family disagreements and criminal behavior. Other family members seemed to blame me for somehow enabling or encouraging Marcus's criminal behavior. You always gave him everything he wanted without making him work for it, my brother-in-law suggested during what was supposed to be a supportive conversation. Maybe if you'd been tougher with him when he was younger, he wouldn't have thought he could take advantage of you now. The blame and second-guessing from people who hadn't experienced the manipulation themselves added another layer of isolation to an already difficult recovery process. I began declining invitations to family events and social gatherings where I might encounter people who viewed Marcus as the victim of my vindictiveness rather than the perpetrator of calculated fraud. The loneliness was profound, but it felt safer than constantly defending my decision to protect myself from my own son's criminal behavior. Therapy became essential for processing the complex emotions surrounding the betrayal and its aftermath. Dr. Rachel Kim, a psychologist who specialized in family trauma and elder abuse, helped me understand that my experience was more common than I had realized. Family financial abuse is one of the most underreported crimes in America. Adult children who systematically steal from their parents often use emotional manipulation and guilt to prevent their victims from seeking help or pressing charges. Dr. Kim helped me recognize the sophisticated psychological techniques Marcus and Jessica had used to maintain control over the situation. They isolated you from outside perspectives by positioning themselves as your primary advisors and information sources. Every question you raised was met with reasonable-sounding explanations that made you doubt your own perceptions. That's a classic pattern in financial abuse cases. Understanding the mechanics of how I'd been manipulated helped reduce some of the self-blame and shame I was carrying. The fraud hadn't happened because I was naive or stupid, but because Marcus and Jessica had exploited my love and trust with techniques they'd clearly researched and planned in advance. Recognizing that I'd been the target of a sophisticated criminal scheme rather than the victim of my own poor judgment was an important step in rebuilding my confidence and decision-making abilities.
The therapy also helped me process the grief of losing the son I thought I'd raised. The person who betrayed you wasn't the child you remember or the adult you hoped he'd become, Dr. Kim explained. Grieving the loss of that relationship is necessary, even though Marcus is still alive. The person you trusted and loved may never have existed in the way you believed. That concept was both heartbreaking and liberating. It allowed me to mourn the loss of my dreams for Marcus while accepting that those dreams had been based on an idealized version of him that didn't match reality. The son who'd systematically planned to steal my security and independence wasn't the same person who'd made me proud at his wedding or excited about his business ambitions. Somewhere along the way, either gradually or suddenly, he'd become someone capable of treating his own mother as nothing more than a source of funding for his lifestyle ambitions. 18 months after the criminal trials ended, I received an unexpected letter from Marcus in prison. The envelope had been forwarded through my attorney's office since I'd requested no direct contact during his incarceration. For several days, I couldn't decide whether to read it or simply destroy it without opening it. Eventually, curiosity and a lingering hope for some acknowledgement of the harm he'd caused convinced me to read what he'd written. The letter was 3 pages of what I can only describe as calculated manipulation disguised as remorse. Marcus acknowledged that his actions had been wrong and claimed to understand the pain he'd caused, but every apology was followed by explanations that shifted responsibility away from himself. I know I made terrible decisions, but the stress of trying to make the restaurant successful while keeping Jessica happy created pressure that led me to justify things I never should have done, he wrote. He blamed Jessica for most of the financial manipulation, claiming she'd pressured him into increasingly desperate measures to keep their marriage intact. I was trying to be the husband she wanted and the son you deserved, but I got caught between conflicting demands that made me lose sight of what was right, the letter continued. Even in prison, facing the consequences of his crimes, Marcus couldn't take full responsibility for his choices or acknowledge the calculated nature of his betrayal. The letter concluded with a request for financial support during his incarceration and a suggestion that we could rebuild our relationship once he was released. I've learned so much about myself during these months in prison, and I want the chance to show you the person I'm becoming, he wrote. Family is the most important thing, and I hope we can find a way to heal the damage I caused through my poor decisions. Reading those words felt like being slapped across the face. After everything he'd stolen, every lie he'd told, every plan he'd made to eliminate me from my own life, Marcus still believed he was entitled to my forgiveness and continued support. The letter contained no genuine recognition of the trauma he'd caused or acknowledgement that I had every right to protect myself from further victimization. I showed the letter to Dr. Kim during our next therapy session, curious about her professional assessment of Marcus's supposed remorse. "This is what we call a non-apology apology," she explained after reading it carefully. "He's using language that sounds remorseful, but he's not actually accepting responsibility for his actions. Every statement of regret is followed by an excuse or justification that minimizes his culpability." Dr. Kim pointed out specific phrases that revealed Marcus's continued manipulation attempts. When he says poor decisions instead of crimes or betrayal, he's minimizing the severity of his actions. When he blames Jessica or claims he was under pressure, he's avoiding ownership of his choices. And when he asks for financial support while suggesting reconciliation, he's still trying to access your resources even from prison. The letter crystallized something important for me about the nature of forgiveness and family relationships. Forgiveness didn't require maintaining a relationship with someone who'd proven they couldn't be trusted. Love didn't mean accepting continued exploitation or manipulation from someone who viewed my compassion as weakness to be exploited. I could acknowledge that Marcus was my son, while also accepting that he'd chosen to become someone I couldn't safely have in my life. I decided not to respond to the letter or provide any financial support during his incarceration. The decision wasn't made out of spite or revenge, but from a recognition that Marcus's fundamental attitudes toward me and my resources hadn't changed. Until he could demonstrate genuine accountability for his actions and respect for my right to protect myself, any contact between us would simply create opportunities for continued manipulation. That choice was difficult, but liberating. It meant accepting that the family I'd imagined having with my son would never exist. But it also meant I could focus on rebuilding my life without constantly worrying about the next scheme or manipulation attempt.
The grief was real and lasting, but so was the peace that came from no longer living in fear of my own child's intentions. The catering business recovered more successfully than I had initially hoped. 2 years after the legal battles ended, Caldwell Catering was not only financially stable, but growing again. New clients appreciated our reputation for reliability and quality, and several former clients returned after seeing that we'd weathered the crisis without compromising our standards. The experience had actually strengthened some business relationships, as clients respected my determination to protect the company's integrity despite personal costs. Managing the legal battles while maintaining business operations had required skills I'd never needed before. Working with attorneys and investigators, understanding complex financial documents, presenting evidence clearly and persuasively. The woman who'd once relied on her husband to handle administrative complexities had become someone capable of navigating the most challenging legal and financial situations independently. Maria Santos became my business partner during the third year of recovery. Her loyalty and competence during the crisis had proven she understood both the practical and philosophical foundations of what we'd built together. Giving her ownership stake in the company ensured Caldwell Catering would continue even after I decided to reduce my involvement, and it created the succession plan I should have developed years earlier instead of assuming Marcus would eventually join the business. The partnership with Maria also addressed one of the most painful lessons from the experience with Marcus. I'd assumed that family relationships automatically created business compatibility and shared values, but that assumption had nearly destroyed everything I'd worked to build. Maria had earned her place in the company through years of demonstrated commitment and competence, qualities that mattered more than genetic relationships when it came to protecting the business's future. 3 years after Marcus's sentencing, I received word that he'd been released early for good behavior. The news created a wave of anxiety I hadn't felt since the legal battles ended, as I wondered whether he might attempt to contact me or create new problems. My attorney had helped me obtain a restraining order that prohibited direct contact, but I knew Marcus was intelligent enough to find indirect ways of inserting himself into my life if he chose to. For several months, I found myself looking over my shoulder and questioning whether strangers who approached me might be connected to Marcus somehow. The hypervigilance was exhausting and reminded me how deeply the betrayal had affected my ability to feel secure in the world. Dr. Kim assured me that this level of caution was normal and healthy given what I'd experienced, but it was still frustrating to realize how much space Marcus's actions continued to occupy in my mind. The anticipated contact never came, though I occasionally heard updates through mutual acquaintances about his activities after prison. Marcus had moved to California and was apparently working in restaurant management under an assumed name, probably to avoid background check issues related to his fraud convictions. Jessica had also relocated after her release, and they were no longer together, according to the reports I received. Knowing they were both far away and focused on rebuilding their own lives brought some relief, but it also reinforced how completely our family relationships had been severed. The son I'd raised and loved had become a stranger, whose location and activities I monitored for security reasons rather than out of parental affection. The finality of that loss was something I continued working through in therapy, even as other aspects of my life returned to stability and growth. Now, 5 years after discovering Marcus and Jessica's betrayal, I've built a life that feels both familiar and completely different from what I had imagined. Caldwell Catering continues to thrive under my partnership with Maria, and I've gradually reduced my daily involvement to focus on strategic planning and client relationships I particularly enjoy. The business provides financial security and personal satisfaction without the overwhelming demands that once consumed every aspect of my time. I've also developed new relationships and interests that enrich my life in ways I hadn't expected. A grief support group led me to friendships with other women who'd experienced various forms of family betrayal, and those relationships provided understanding and acceptance I couldn't find elsewhere. Volunteering with elder abuse prevention organizations allowed me to use my experience constructively by helping other victims recognize manipulation and access resources for protection. The woman I've become through surviving this experience is stronger and more independent than the person who first agreed to invest in Marcus's restaurant dream.
I trust my own judgment more completely now, having learned that my instincts about people and situations are generally accurate when I listen to them instead of being swayed by emotional manipulation. The confidence that comes from surviving attempted destruction by someone I loved has proven surprisingly empowering in all areas of my life. I still think about Marcus sometimes, usually when I encounter other parents struggling with adult children's problems, or when I see families celebrating achievements together. There's sadness in those moments, but no longer the sharp pain that once accompanied any reminder of what we'd lost. Time and therapy have helped me accept that some relationships can't be repaired, no matter how much love was invested in them originally. The most important lesson from this experience isn't about recognizing fraud or protecting assets, though those skills proved essential. It's about understanding that love doesn't require accepting abuse, that family loyalty has limits, and that protecting yourself from people who wish you harm is always appropriate, regardless of your relationship with them. Those boundaries aren't cruel or unforgiving. They're necessary for maintaining the dignity and security that everyone deserves, especially in their later years. My advice to anyone facing similar situations is simple but difficult to follow. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Ask for help from professionals who understand financial crimes, and remember that you're not responsible for fixing or excusing other people's criminal behavior, even when those people are your own children. Family relationships should enhance your life, not threaten your security or independence. The story I've shared isn't one I ever wanted to live through, but it's also a story of survival, recovery, and ultimately of building something better from the pieces of what was destroyed. That's a lesson worth more than any amount of money that was stolen, and it's knowledge I'll carry with confidence for whatever years remain ahead of me. The turning point in my emotional recovery came during an unexpected encounter at a coffee shop near my catering facility. I was reviewing vendor contracts on a quiet Tuesday morning when a woman at the next table answered her phone with obvious distress. "Mom, I can't keep lending you money. You borrowed $3,000 last month for your business, and now you're asking for $5,000 more. Something doesn't add up." I couldn't help but overhear as the conversation continued, with the woman explaining to whoever was on the other end that she'd discovered discrepancies in her mother's financial statements. "The restaurant receipts you showed me don't match the amounts you withdrew from my account. I think someone might be taking advantage of you, but you won't let me see your actual books or talk to your business partner directly." The parallels to my own experience were so striking that I felt compelled to approach the woman after she ended the call. Her name was Jennifer Walsh, and she was dealing with concerns about her elderly mother's new business partnership with a man who claimed to be helping her start a small bakery.
Sharing my experience with other victims and their families helped me process my own trauma while providing practical assistance to people facing similar challenges. The work gave me a sense of purpose that was separate from both my business responsibilities and my personal grief over losing Marcus. The most significant milestone in my personal healing came during the 4th year after Marcus's conviction, when I realized I could think about him and our situation without experiencing the sharp anger and pain that had dominated my emotions for so long. The sadness remained. I continued to grieve the loss of the relationship I'd hoped to have with my son, but the consuming rage and sense of betrayal had gradually transformed into something more manageable. That emotional shift allowed me to evaluate my experience more objectively and identify lessons that went beyond the immediate circumstances of financial fraud. The most important realization was that I'd spent decades enabling Marcus's irresponsible behavior in small ways that had ultimately contributed to his willingness to victimize me on a large scale. Every time I'd covered his debts, made excuses for his failures, or provided financial support without requiring accountability, I'd reinforced his belief that my resources were available to solve his problems. This recognition wasn't about accepting blame for his criminal behavior. Marcus alone was responsible for his choices to commit fraud and theft. But understanding my own role in creating patterns of financial dependency helped me develop healthier boundaries in all my relationships.
I became more willing to say no to requests for money or assistance when those requests seemed designed to avoid natural consequences rather than address genuine emergencies. The boundary setting extended beyond financial matters to other aspects of my relationships with family members and friends. I became less willing to accept disrespectful treatment or manipulation tactics, even in mild forms that I might have overlooked previously. The experience of being systematically exploited by someone I loved had taught me that small boundary violations often escalate into larger ones when they're not addressed promptly and clearly. These new boundaries initially created some tension in relationships with people who'd become accustomed to my accommodating nature. Some family members seemed to interpret my increased assertiveness as coldness or selfishness, not understanding that I was protecting my own well-being rather than rejecting them personally. Over time, most relationships adapted to the new dynamic, and many became stronger as a result of increased honesty and mutual respect. The changes in my personal relationships were paralleled by evolution in my business leadership style. I became more direct in addressing performance issues with employees and more willing to terminate relationships with clients who treated my staff disrespectfully or consistently paid their bills late. The experience of being taken advantage of in my personal life had made me less tolerant of exploitation in professional contexts as well. Maria noticed these changes and commented on how they'd improved the overall culture at Caldwell Catering. "You used to absorb a lot of stress from difficult people instead of addressing problems directly," she observed during one of our partnership meetings. "Now you deal with issues before they become bigger problems, which makes everything run more smoothly for everyone." The business improvements reinforced my growing understanding that protecting myself from exploitation wasn't selfish or cruel. It was necessary for maintaining the energy and resources needed to support people and causes I genuinely cared about. By refusing to enable destructive behavior or accept disrespectful treatment, I became more available to provide meaningful help to people who approached me with integrity and genuine need. Looking back on the 5 years since discovering Marcus's betrayal, I can see how the experience forced me to develop strengths and insights I might never have gained otherwise. The woman I'd been before the fraud was more trusting, but also more vulnerable to manipulation. She was generous, but sometimes indiscriminate in that generosity, providing help without considering whether that help might ultimately harm both giver and recipient. The woman I became through surviving systematic betrayal was more cautious, but also more confident in her own judgment. She was still generous, but more strategic about how and when to provide assistance. Most importantly, she understood that love and family loyalty didn't require accepting abuse or enabling destructive behavior from people who claimed to care about her. These weren't easy lessons to learn, and I wouldn't recommend the particular educational experience I endured to anyone. But having survived it and found ways to use the knowledge constructively, I can honestly say that I'm stronger and more capable now than I was before Marcus's betrayal shattered my assumptions about family relationships and financial security. The future I'm building for myself is different from what I'd once imagined, but no less meaningful or satisfying. It's based on relationships I've chosen and earned, rather than ones I'd simply assumed were permanent. It's funded by work I continue to find fulfilling and managed according to principles I've tested under the most challenging circumstances. Most importantly, it's protected by boundaries I've learned to maintain without guilt or apology, ensuring that my remaining years will be spent according to my own values and priorities rather than anyone else's manipulative agenda. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.